Greetings, geologists, and we're going to be learning about evolution and mass extinctions today. Look at this picture and look at all the clues in the picture. Tell me what you see. Look at the ground, look at the mural, look at the rock outcrop to the right, look at the direction of the dinosaur, which I might add is an Allosaurus. Well, he's gone extinct. You didn't need me to tell you that. You know that all quote-unquote dinosaurs have gone extinct. I want to correct that and say non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. But we're going to talk about how do we know these things go extinct, how do organisms even evolve, and we're going to talk about some of the concerns and issues that people have when it comes to the thoughts about evolution. There's plenty of evidence for evolution. Unfortunately, evolution gets a bad rap for its name, probably because people see it as a challenge to their religious beliefs, when quite the contrary, it is just evidence that's out there in the world, both the physical world and I might add certainly the biological world. We see the earth change, we see organisms change, and that's all evolution means, is that it's something's changed through time. And specifically when we're referring to evolution in this context, we're referring to organisms. We know life originated in the Precambrian eon as a single-celled organism, blue-green algae, otherwise known as cyanobacteria. Well, how did cyanobacteria get to this right here? A complex reptile. Something had to happen for that to occur, because we don't find this guy way back when with the first set of fossils. There's a theme in this course regarding life, that it originated as a simplistic life form and advances throughout time. I'm not telling you that we eliminate the simplistic life forms at all. Quite the contrary. Blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, is extremely common today. Matter of fact, it's probably one of the most successful evolutionary developments in the history of organisms, because it survived all of geologic time and every mass extinction in terms of being able to reproduce. So evolution encompasses a small-scale genetic population that has a change plus a large-scale development of new species from some common ancestor. That's another area where evolution gets kind of a bad reputation. Is I think in general people struggle with where did we come from, and the standard thing people say is we came from a chimpanzee. That is not true. We'll get to that later in this semester. That's our closest living ancestor today. That is something that you need to differentiate in your mind as we're going through evolution, is to realize that we're not trying to challenge your belief structure. We're trying to show you what evidence exists in the rock record. And then to also examine the other side of the story, which is that we don't have a complete rock record. What we do not account for in evolution when we're talking about the development of life is non-organic changes during a normal life cycle of a life form. So we're not addressing, let's say, simply a change in earth materials or a change in the earth itself on how it affected an animal. Certainly environmental changes influence an animal, but that's not evolution. Evolution comes from a different set of circumstances, and let's take a look at what some of those are. Continuing with our definition of evolution, it does not try to answer the question of how life originated. Everybody wants that answer. Maybe someday we'll know. But I have this thought, it may not be for us to know while we're here on this earth. What evolution addresses is how life has changed and diversified with time. This is a fossil I saw when I was at the Alaskan Heritage Museum. That's in Anchorage, or right outside of it actually. And how did we come up with this organism? How did whales evolve? Well, we know whales are mammals. Did they crawl back from the land back to sea, vice versa? How did we get an animal this shape, this size? Those are questions I would like answers to. Evolution is a way to help us address some of those key factors. The fossil evidence in the rock record indicates a very clear distinction that we have simple to more complex organisms. I can't stress how important that is to go from blue-green algae to something like this, that is a dinosaur. You don't get that overnight. So that is a challenge to Genesis, a very big challenge, because I think the literal interpretation of a day is where people get hung up, where God created all the animals, and then he created man, and he created the earth in a day. Is that true? Those of you taking this class may or may not know me on a personal basis. If you ask me what my religious beliefs were, you might get a surprise. What I have come to realize through the study of rocks and fossils and stratigraphy and geology is that there is a definite development of organisms, almost like trial and error. So however this worked, if the earth is a big laboratory experiment, or if it all got developed in a matter of 7 days, according to Genesis, to me it really doesn't matter, because the life is here. That doesn't challenge how I believe in terms of my religious thoughts, because I'm not going to literally read every word that I see, even in scientific manuals, unless there's some data behind it that can help me understand. And even then, I understand there's room for error. So let's take a look and understand that simple to more advanced organisms is the message in evolution. So you see blue-green algae here from stromatolites in Shark Bay, and then you see a dinosaur skull from Dinosaur National Monument of an Allosaurus. How did we get from A to B? How did A, over here on the left, outlive B? That was much bigger, much stronger, much higher on the food chain. So I think that puts some challenges for how your perception may look for evolution. So let's get busy. Until the 1700s, and really until the late 1800s, Genesis was the foundation of where we considered the beginning of time for the clock of the earth. The first 2 chapters clearly outline a chronology of how the earth was made. And that was taken as the truth of what we believe in as humans for the clock for the world. Naturalists who were actually looking for evidence to support Genesis stumbled upon evidence in the rock record that totally counteracted that and put in for a big surprise, changing the thought process over a period of time with a number of very important people that we're fixing to look at. The first one of these is a really famous guy by the last name of Lamarck. He said in his works that there was an inheritance of acquired characteristics, suggesting that new traits developed in organisms because of their needs, and these traits got passed on to their offspring. Genetics has since proven Lamarck's inheritance of acquired characteristics as incorrect, because genes cannot be altered in a human lifetime. This will be no surprise to you that Charles Robert Darwin is a very important guy to evolution. He gets most of his fame from the term survival of the fittest, where I'm not exactly sure that you can say he's the sole originating thought on that. It's certainly associated with him. He's also associated with natural selection. When he was aboard the Beagle for the years that he sailed around South America, he came up with a number of different thoughts on organisms, not just birds and finches that he's most famous for, his writings, but on other animals and fossils that he observed in his travels. His 3 primary thought process were this. Number 1, organisms in all population possess heritable variations. In other words, there'll be different characteristics within the same animal group because they all have different characteristics. Some variations are more favorable than others to avoid predation. That could be coloring, ability to disguise, ability to burrow, an ability to climb. There's a lot of things that could look like. Number 3, organisms with favorable variations are more likely to survive and pass on their favorable traits. That does not mean that the strongest, the biggest, and the fastest are going to be the ones that survive. It just said there's a higher probable chance that could occur. Survival of the fittest needs to be examined, and I'm going to challenge you on your thoughts about this. Certainly, nature has selected for a number of organisms to go extinct, but a number of these organisms were very strong, very large, very much top of their food chain at the time. We assume that the strongest, fastest, and the biggest life survives, but look at this woolly mammoth fossil right here. It was the biggest animal alive next to a Columbian mammoth, which was just a few feet taller during its time. How did it go extinct? Why was it selected for extinct and modern day elephants are with us today? Something's up with that question. So I think you have to ask yourself to reshape your paradigm about what survival of the fittest means, and it goes to the word fittest. So we're going to look at a couple of things that may change your thought process on fittest and let you recognize that fittest really basically boils down to one thing. Can you pass your traits on? That's the survival of the fittest. There's several types of selection. One is called sexual selection. And a classic case of this would be, this is the Atwater prairie chicken. If you've never seen one, it is worth going to see. The chicken dance kind of originates from this because it's really, they're funny birds. They make quite a spectacle during their mating season. And the idea is the guy with the biggest, greatest voice and golden throat wins the ladies, and they make new ones. They make new Atwater prairie chickens. I might add that they're critically endangered species, and there is a national wildlife refuge down in southeast Texas near Eagle Lake. But fascinating animal indeed. So when you talk about sexual selection, there's some kind of a trait that when males are competing for a mate, the females select based on these favorable traits these male counterparts may have. Obviously, sexual selection is difficult to prove in the fossil record since we don't have all of their physical traits preserved there, but we can certainly see it in modern biology. More important for fossil record and certainly even for living fitness in terms of populations of biology is sexual fitness from this perspective. Sexual fitness is simply the ability of an organism to successfully breed and successfully pass on their characteristics. If you understand this concept, you get it, that there could be a completely unrelated event that could cause the strongest, the fastest, the best, the most, what would seem like survival of the fittest type animal to go extinct simply because they cannot breed and pass on their characteristics. All right, so let's just use these bugs as an example. Let's say that we have a beetle convention where you live, and every beetle in the world comes to your location. So we got brown beetles and we got green beetles. Well, all the brown beetles are on one side because they have a meeting on one side of the town, and all the green beetles are on the other side. Somehow we have a mass catastrophe like a giant earthquake or sinkhole, and all of the brown ones fall into the sinkhole and die. Didn't impact the green ones very much. The green ones are still alive. Now the brown ones were more fit prior to this event. They were the ones that passed their traits on more often. The data would suggest this. They have a higher fitness level relative to the green ones. But if I take the brown ones out of the equation because of a random fluke event, the green ones will now be able to pass on their traits, which makes them more sexually fit, ultimately going to be survival of the fittest. So be careful when you're thinking about survival of the fittest not to forget to remember how important sexual fitness is. That plays a huge role in what we see in the fossil record, whether animals go extinct or whether they do not, if they evolve into more complex versions of themselves. Another important person in the evolutionary story for talking about sexual fitness and survival of the fittest is when we discovered genetics. Gregor Mendel in 1860 did some experiments on his garden peas and determined that some of the flowers, like their specific traits of the color flowers or the type of flower they have, impacted the pair that would end up reproducing and making peas. He referred to these as genes, which are now called alleles. Alleles may dominate one over another in an animal, which will give them specific traits that they possess. Offspring receive one allele of each type from their parents, and so we know that genes do not blend during inheritance and that they can show up later in a population. And I think a good example might be, you hear that twins skip a generation. Well, that's a trait that is in the gene pool, but it doesn't affect every single population that gives birth that has that gene. So do you have a situation in your family where there's a trait, maybe a nose or a type of eyes or a color of hair that's dominant in your family, and then all of a sudden you get a random color? Well, that could be a mutation, that could be a recessive gene, an allele that gets passed on and shows up in a later population. Genetics addresses DNA, which contains chromosomes which are found in the cells of all living organisms. Genes basically are the blueprint of the hereditary units of a DNA molecule. So this artwork that we have in the science building at McLennan Community College is a DNA strand. If you're ever in the building, you should take a peek of it. It's where the main stairwell is. It's really quite fascinating. And it's showing you the double helix strand that everybody thinks of with DNA. Now, chromosomes vary by organisms, and that's what makes us unique. And I'm just going to cover 3 here when there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of organisms we could cover. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Fruit flies have 8. Domestic horses have 64, so don't use the higher the number as the more complex the animal. We know that humans have a higher IQ than horses, but nevertheless they have fewer chromosomes than they do. Chromosomes simply are the genetic material that make up and end up being the organism that evolves. Couple of thoughts that you need to put into your brain along with sexual fitness and survival of the fittest and sexual selection is genetic drift. These are random, completely random changes in a population due to chance. It's kind of what I was talking about with the green and the brown beetles. And this is an example of that catastrophe. So sometimes you have to realize that these terms are very similar in what they mean. So genetic drift is going to occur in a population for one reason or another. So this guy smushing a bunch of the green ones, and now all you're left with is 1 green and 6 brown over here to reproduce. So the browns are probably going to be the ones that are survival of the fittest because the green ones don't have a heavy presence in population in their genetic process. So over time, the genetic drift will lean more towards the alleles and the DNA of the brown beetles versus the green beetles. Sometimes we get a mutation. Don't confuse mutations with X-Men, for example. It makes them superheroes. Not saying it can't, but mutations are random. These are changes in the chromosomes or genes, meaning the hereditary information changes. Sometimes there's a gap in the sequencing of DNA. Since mutations are random, they have 3 options that could happen as a consequence of their occurrence. 1, they're completely neutral. They have no pro or con situation to the animal's existence. Number 2, they're harmful to the animal's existence. Maybe you have a mutation where you're susceptible to a certain type of cancer cell development. Number 3 mutation, it's a benefit to you. So there could be some type of mutation that gives you a superhero type of benefit for your physical being. Nevertheless, let's look at this domesticated cat that has a mutation of 2 different colored eyes. Does that benefit that cat? Hard to say if he sees better out of the left or the right eye, the kind of greenish eye versus the blue eye. But nevertheless, he's got a mutation. So the mutation may or may not cause an impact to the animal, good, bad, or indifferent. Some mutations can be harmful. Some mutations can be good. So mutations happen regularly throughout genetic changes in populations of animals. Speciation. What is it? This is how a new species arises from an ancestral species. Species are defined as a population of similar animals or individuals that have the ability to interbreed and, key thing here, produce fertile offspring. Are you seeing a theme? If you can reproduce, that's one thing, but to provide offspring that are viable, fertile for reproduction is the key for becoming a species. It's a key for being survival of the fittest. It's what Darwin had in mind with his natural selection theory. We also have to examine micro versus macroevolution. Microevolution involves changes of a population that is living, where macro involves changes like an origin of a new species, genera, families, orders, classes from Linnaean classification system. So let's look at this. This would be 2 fruit flies, and we have a speciation event that changes 2 different species, but it came from a different ancestor. So sometimes we have situations where organisms will branch off and make new species for one reason or another. But remember, a species is defined as a population of similar individuals that can interbreed. So your question may be, well, could these 2 guys interbreed and make another species? The answer is maybe. So if a horse and a donkey breed, what do they get? You're going to go, well, a mule. Okay, well, does a mule have the ability to make offspring? So you have to ask yourself those questions in order to understand what the real definition of a species is. Well, that brings us to types of evolution, and I'd like to take a break and come back for more in just a few minutes. That's a lot to take in a short period of time about evolution. So as you leave your thoughts from this first part of the evolutionary lesson, I need you to focus on a few things. Did you understand what evolution definition is and how it's not about challenging your religious beliefs if you have them or if you don't? We're simply looking at factual information, understanding that science is a evolutionary process in itself with change from data, testing, lab experiments, and so forth. Second, did you understand what survival of the fittest really is? Did you come away with the fact that reproduction of fertile offspring is the key element of what makes survival of the fittest? Did you understand the difference between sexual selection and sexual fitness, and mutations, genetic drift? Because those are important terms that will help set the stage for the remainder of our discussions. I'll see you back in a little bit. Bye.